Would you all pray with me? Lord, you called Peter, as imperfect as he was, to be the rock upon which you would build the church, and you gave him keys to heaven and hell. Just as you called him, you have called us. Help us have ears to hear that the confession that we make is first and foremost about you and your love for us and all of creation. Amen. There is a church on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It's actually not just a church, it's a cathedral. It is called the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Kids, construction of this church began not in the 1900s, but in the 1800s, which tells you that it's even older than your parents are. It began in 1892, and more than a century later, they have not completed construction. So trustees, it's okay if we're behind on this entrance. There was a story that ran in the New York Times about this church, and the name that they gave to this story was St. John the Unfinished. Not much of a building campaign slogan, right? Not many church consultants would tell you to tell people, come worship with us. We've been working on the building since the Cleveland administration, and we're not done yet, but sure, come on in. The building still isn't finished. There, if you look up at the front of the cathedral, there are towers that are unfinished. There are parts of the original design that haven't made it any further than the blueprints they were originally written on. And in all likelihood, St. John the Divine will be under construction for centuries to come. And still, every single Sunday, the church gathers, they pray beneath unfinished stone, and the gospel is proclaimed in an unfinished building. Bread is broken, wine is poured, children are baptized, couples are married, the dead are buried. But apparently, no one at St. John the Divine got the memo that you're supposed to finish a church before you start using the church. Which brings us to Peter. Jesus and his disciples have gone to Caesarea, and Jesus asks them a simple question. Who do the people say that I am? And the answers are Sunday school obvious. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the other prophets. Meaning that everybody has an opinion about Jesus. I guess not much has changed in 2,000 years. We have Jesus, the moral teacher, Jesus, the revolutionary, Jesus, the therapist, Jesus, the life coach, Jesus, the defender of traditional Christian values, and you get to pick what those values are. Jesus, the progressive activist who conveniently agrees with everything that I posted on Facebook this morning. We are remarkably talented at creating Jesuses who already agree with our opinions about the world and about him. But Jesus is less interested in the latest neighborhood polling, so he turns this question to his disciples. Remember, these guys have been following him for quite some time. They've seen the miracles, they've seen the healings, they've heard his teachings. And to them, he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter, because he's Peter, is the first to chime in. He says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And for once, Peter got it right on the first try. If the gospel ended right there, Peter would have a very good Sunday morning. Jesus calls Peter blessed. He calls him the rock upon which the church will be built. He gives Peter the keys to the kingdom. I've been a pastor through 3 presidential administrations, and no one has ever offered me keys to any kingdom. I was given a set of keys by Ronnie when I first got here, and I don't know what half of them go to. Peter declares the thing that makes the church, that Jesus is the Messiah. Christianity is not first and foremost a philosophy, nor is it a collection of good ideas or a moral improvement program or a political platform with hymns attached. And contrary to popular evidence, Christianity is not principally about committee meetings. Christianity is about Jesus. If we were to take Jesus out of the equation, I'm sure that this would still be a lovely organization. We might still feed the hungry. You'd probably still sing beautiful music, probably still host the best potlucks on Cameron Mills Road. And we might even become a nonprofit that wins awards and is featured in local news stories. But without Jesus, we would not have Christianity. The astonishing Christian claim is not simply that God has given us a little bit of information about God to make us feel better about our lives. The claim is that God has given us God. In Jesus Christ, God has come among us in flesh and blood. The Galilean Jew who eats with sinners, who touches lepers, who forgives enemies, who welcomes children, casts out the demons and feeds the hungry. This Jesus keeps hanging around with the sort of people that respectable religion has taught us to avoid. That one, that Jesus, that is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Peter got it right. The problem for Peter is that he almost has no idea what he's saying. And we know this because inconveniently for Peter, Matthew keeps writing. The lectionary stopped at verse 20 today, but Matthew keeps going. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus names him to be the rock. But just a few verses later, this rock will begin to crack as Jesus explains to the disciples exactly what it means to be the Messiah. He tells them that the Messiah will go to Jerusalem, where he will suffer. He will be rejected and killed. And on the third day, he'll be raised. And Peter hears all of this and thinks that Jesus has misunderstood what it means to be the Messiah. So Peter has a great idea. He's going to pull Jesus aside and set him straight. Think about that for a moment. Peter has been willing to publicly confess Jesus as the Messiah for about 6 verses, and then feels qualified to explain to Jesus how he is supposed to be Jesus. Which, if we're going to be fair to Peter, it's pretty much what the church has been doing ever since this moment. Peter has the correct word, Messiah. He just has the wrong definition. You see, Peter wants a Messiah who wins, who takes charge, who fixes people who need fixing, and who flexes a little divine muscle every now and then. Peter knows that Jesus is the Messiah, but what Peter does not know yet is that Jesus is the one who gets to decide what Messiah means. And Jesus defines Messiah at the cross. The cross is not a tragic interruption to Jesus' otherwise promising ministry. The cross is not God's plan B, nor is it what happened when Jesus' PR team lost control of the message. At the cross, we find out who God is. That God does not save the world by becoming better at violence than we are. God doesn't beat Caesar by becoming a bigger Caesar. No, God comes down into the mess, our mess. God is willing to give himself away. God entering our suffering, our sin, our rejection, violence, and death, and takes that whole rotten mess into himself. And then Easter happens. God raises the crucified Jesus from the dead and vindicates everything that we call foolish. Peter's confession is right, but the cross is going to spend the rest of Peter's life teaching him what his confession means. That sounds all too familiar. We stand in church on Sunday mornings and we say things that are truer than we actually understand them to be. Week after week, we declare that Jesus Christ is Lord of all creation, of the cosmos. I've heard you say it. I've heard you sing it. I've said it. I've sung it. But do we actually understand what we are proclaiming? We say that the one through whom all things were made was hung dead on a Roman cross. We say that in our baptism we die and we rise with Jesus. We come to the table and we say somehow in bread and wine Christ is giving himself to us. We stand beside coffins and we dare to say Christ is risen. Christian confession has never depended on our ability to explain every inch of the mystery. And Peter is proof of that. He gets the answer right and still has to spend the rest of his life catching up to the answer. And that's where grace comes in. You see, Jesus knows all of this about Peter. Jesus knows what's going to come next, 6 verses later. He knows that within minutes, Peter is going to rebuke him, and then chapters later, Peter will be the one to deny knowing Jesus 3 times. And still, Jesus gives Peter the keys to the kingdom. Friends, that's grace. Jesus gives the keys to the kingdom to a man who doesn't yet understand the lock, and he says, upon that person I will build the church. There's an important word in that sentence that we routinely overlook. Jesus says, I will build my church. I. Jesus is the one building us up into his body, which is fortunate for us considering the building materials. We have Peter, who denies knowing Jesus. We have doubting Thomas. We have Matthew, the tax collector. We have a zealot. We have people who misunderstand Jesus, people who argue about who he is, people who fell asleep in the garden when Jesus asked them to stay awake with him. These are the stones that Jesus picks up and says, yeah, I can work with this. Grace rummages around in the rubble and finds what the world has discarded and says, perfect. That is more or less the story of the church. And since I'm still relatively new here, let me tell you something about the kind of church I hope that we can be together. My hope is that Trinity will continue to be a place where people do not need perfect answers in order to belong. It's my hope that this church is a place where people can say, I don't know, and we don't feel the need to fix them. Where someone can say, I'm not sure I believe that, and we don't form a committee to deal with them. A place where children can ask the questions that adults have stopped asking years ago because adults learned that pretending to understand is easier than trying to understand. Where people who have followed Jesus for 70 years can admit that Jesus still surprises them. When a church where someone can walk through that door, or that door, or that door, or that door, knowing almost nothing except that they need grace and that they discover that grace has been following them the whole time. Not because our theology matters most. It matters enormously. But because if we are going to be a church that takes God seriously and we take theology seriously so that we understand God more seriously, our theology ought to make us humble, more humble and not less. The church is built upon a confession that is bigger than anything we can comprehend. That's why I think about St. John the Unfinished. For more than a century, people have walked beneath unfinished stonework that someone else intended to fix and finish years ago, but never did. And still the church worships. The church still prays. The church still proclaims Christ as Lord. And Jesus still shows up. I'm beginning to believe that every church needs to have unfinished somewhere on their signage. Trinity United Methodist Church, Alexandria, Virginia, unfinished. That would be the most honest thing a church could say in advertising itself. We are unfinished. Our theology is unfinished. Our discipleship is unfinished. Our understanding of who Jesus is unfinished. Your pastor is unfinished. The person sitting next to you is most certainly unfinished. Peter is still unfinished. And to all of our unfinishedness, Jesus says, yeah, I can build with that. The good news is not that one day we will understand enough of Jesus for Jesus to finally love us. The good news is that before Peter understands the cross, before Peter understands Easter, before Peter knows how badly Peter is going to fail, Jesus has already called him blessed, already given Peter the keys to the kingdom, and has already made Peter a promise. I will build my church, Jesus says. So when Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? We answer with Peter, you are the Messiah, the Son of our living God. And then we spend the rest of our lives rediscovering, and for some, discovering for the very first time, how much more gracious and strange, crucified, risen, and alive the answer is than we could ever imagine. The church is built on a confession that we do not understand yet, and held together by grace that we did not create on our own. And friends, that's enough. Not because our confession is small, but because Jesus is so much bigger. The church is unfinished. We are unfinished. But thanks be to God that Christ is still building. Amen.